Hello and welcome to this episode of the TheDirtyAirF1Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Kane, and I would like to dedicate this episode to my very first F1 hero, Gilles Villeneuve.
There is the hero of the day, Gilles Villeneuve. And Villeneuve's going through! Fantastic! Gilles Villeneuve leads! One of the finest drives I have ever seen in Grand Prix racing. Oh, the champagne, the traditional champagne for Gilles Villeneuve. The darling of the Italian crowd.
If you don't have goosebumps going up your arm right now, you're lying. If you're a Formula One fan, you're lying. And if you're old enough like me, you remember Gilles. So hopefully you enjoy this podcast and you laugh along at the stories that I'm about to share, and you remember some of the crazy things that this guy did. And for those of you who are new to this part, this is incredible. I feel so blessed to be able to share with you the memory of Gilles Villeneuve, and for you to be able to research him on YouTube and to look him up and to understand why I truly believe he's the fastest Formula One driver in history. No need to check your ears. You heard me right. Gilles Villeneuve is the fastest Formula One driver in history. And if you don't believe me, just ask Niki Lauda.
Well, Gilles was, I think, a perfect racing driver who knew exactly to take which advantage where, and he was one of the few guys who could take off very well with the turbo engine, because maybe he trained enough for it, so he did a good job on it. Gilles had the best talent of all of us, and in whatever car you would have put him, he would have been quick.
That's pretty high praise coming from Niki Lauda. Now, I know people throw the word GOAT around a lot these days. I mean, let's face it. Some guy has one good game and people say GOAT, GOAT, GOAT. Well, I'm here to tell you that Gilles Villeneuve is the GOAT. So if you'll do me the favor and keep an open mind, let's take a journey together. Let me tell you about the story of Gilles Villeneuve. Then you can make your own mind up, and I will totally respect your opinion, but it won't change mine. Joseph Gilles Henri Villeneuve was born January 18th, 1950, in Bertheville, Quebec. Bertheville is approximately 1 hour away from the circuit that now holds his name and hosts the Canadian Grand Prix. Gilles' first experience driving a car was while sitting on his father's lap, and as he would steer the wheel, he would keep yelling at his father, "Faster, faster, Daddy." His love for speed and all things mechanical would never waver throughout his life. Gilles first started racing by entering his own personal car and drag race events before attending the Jim Russell Racing School in Mont-Tremblant. Lacking the funds to actually start his auto racing career, Gilles instead started racing snowmobiles and soon became the world champion in a snowmobile that he actually designed and built himself. And if you search YouTube, you can actually search something called the Kawartha Cup, which was held in Peterborough, a town in Ontario, Canada, which has about 55,000 people at the time living there, yet 80,000 people attended the race. Gilles was the favorite going into the race and won handily over second-place finisher Eddie Shabinski. In fairness, Eddie did beat third place by quite a margin, but he probably goes down in history as one of the great Shabinskis of all time. Gilles raced 1 year in Formula Ford before moving on to Formula Atlantic, where he raced for 3 years, absolutely dominating the competition. But his big break came in 1976 when James Hunt traveled all the way to Canada to race in a big money race in Trois-Rivières. Gilles won the race handedly, lapping everyone up to fourth place. And James Hunt went back to Mclaren, raving about this great Canadian. Mclaren ended up offering him a drive in 1977, a one-off at Silverstone, where he drove an outdated M23 McLaren to 9th place on the grid. He actually had the car up to 4th place during the race and came into the pits when his water temperature gauge showed that it was overheating. It turned out the gauge was just simply malfunctioning. Gilles ended up finishing 11th, but it seriously impressed people on his debut. Now, can you imagine that? Can you imagine somebody today entering a Formula One race in a car that was approximately 2 years old, qualifying 9th, getting it to 4th, pulling it into the pits based on a mechanical malfunction? I mean, tough luck, but wow. What a debut. Having said this, McLaren decided to go with a British driver to appease their sponsors, and this led Gilles to Scuderia Ferrari. Upon their first meeting, Enzo took a quick look at Gilles and said, "He is Tazio Nuvolari, maybe the most famous Italian race car driver of all time, and completely revered to this day."
E quando mi si è presentato questo piccolo canadese,
and when they presented me with this tiny Canadian, this minuscule bundle of nerves, I instantly recognized in him the physique of the great Nuvolari. And I said to myself, let's give him a try.
And give him a try they did. It was actually, in fact, Gilles' first visit to test for Ferrari. They took not one, but two cars out and destroyed them both. It was at this point that the Ferrari mechanics pleaded with Mr. Ferrari, "Please, get him out." And Enzo said he's the Prince of Destruction, and he will show us what we need to do to be better.
I heard about his spectacular career on snowmobiles. I also heard glowing accounts of his courage. At the time, I was trapped in a difficult situation.
Contrariante, Lauda aveva abbandonato la Ferrari.
Lauda had quit Ferrari.
E poiché Lauda era stato
So taking into account that I had taken Lauda on as a virtual unknown,
era uno sconosciuto, ho pensato
I said to myself, well, if Lauda was out there, there must be others out there too.
Capaci,
others who can climb to the top the way Lauda did.
Ho fatto una scommessa con me stesso. Apporto di ardimento.
He contributed a lot to us with his intense competitiveness.
Della sua capacità distruttiva.
And his talent for taking anything mechanical and utterly destroying it.
Perché lui riusciva a dimostrarci.
He continuously brought us face-to-face with our limitations, face-to-face with the most extreme and unforeseeable tests for the car that our engineers had ever encountered and had to resolve. And he indulged in some of the most hair-raising acrobatics I've ever seen in the process.
In un momento di necessità. Quindi frizioni, cambi,
transmissions, gearboxes, differentials, drive shafts, all were subjected to the utmost punishment. Gilles was the high priest of destruction, but his way of driving showed us what we had to create, how much we had to improve all those parts so they could withstand the assault of any driver.
Villeneuve went out in the third car and set lap record after lap record. And to the mechanic's delight, he brought the car back in one piece, and as he climbed out, all four brakes lit on fire. The chief mechanic said, my brakes, my brakes!" And Gilles said, "I hardly touched them." Enzo smiled. Gilles smiled. Mr. Ferrari had found his new driver. During my research, I have seen an interview of Gilles on the CBC network in Canada, where he mentions that right then and there, Ferrari wanted to sign him to a contract. But to my knowledge, Gilles Villeneuve and Enzo Ferrari shook on a deal, and they kept each other's word until the very end. Gilles returned home to Canada and immediately visited a Canadian tire location, which is an automotive supplier here in Canada, and requested to speak to the manager. The manager, overjoyed to see Gilles, the new Ferrari Formula One driver, invited him into his office. Gilles pulled out a piece of paper out of his pocket and a bag full of price tags. He looked at the manager and said, "I am sorry, but these are all of the things I have taken from your store during my years of racing in Formula Atlantic." The bill amounted to nearly $28,000. Gilles settled up, they shook hands, and Gilles and Joanne were off to Monaco. Gilles would fill in for Niki Lauda, who quit with 2 races remaining in the 1977 season. In one of those races, Gilles did have an altercation with another car. Although never blamed with fault, the car did careen out of control, cartwheeling over the barrier, striking a marshal, and killing several other spectators. These were the early days. These were the warning bells of what was to come. After a disappointing start to the 1978 season, pressure was mounting on Ferrari to replace Villeneuve, until, near the end of the season, he would race at Ile Notre Dame, the circuit in Montreal, his home Grand Prix. This is when Villeneuve's star took off. In terrible weather, Villeneuve wins the inaugural Canadian Grand Prix. Standing on the podium in a winter coat, due to the terrible conditions, this race actually used to be held in late September, early October. But joining him on the podium was then Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau. And Gilles Villeneuve was officially a rock star. As some of you may have seen, there's a picture of me on Twitter sitting in my mother's roasting pan, in my overalls, practicing my driving and my shifting. This was approximately 2.5 to 3 years of age, and sadly, I don't remember Gilles Villeneuve winning the Canadian Grand Prix. I must have been influenced by racing at this point to be sitting in the roasting pan, but unfortunately, I don't remember this, and thankfully, I've seen it on video since. My first memories of Gilles were not until 1979. Carlos Reutemann had been replaced by Jody Scheckter, and the car was competitive. Gilles won his third race of the season, and already was starting to earn a reputation for his mastery in car control, especially in difficult weather. Today we talk about great wet drivers like Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, and Max Verstappen. And we applaud their efforts and notice their skill when they outqualify their opponents by sometimes 1.5 seconds in wet conditions. Having said that, 1979 Watkins Glen is a completely different story. A completely different story. Jody Scheckter went out during practice, and the conditions were absolutely terrible. And he came into the pits, got out of the car, and said, "That's it, I'm not going out anymore." He was absolutely scared stiff, and completely certain that nobody would match his time. That was until his teammate Gilles decided to have a go.
More than anything about Watkins Glen 1979 was qualifying day in perhaps the worst conditions I've ever seen at a racetrack. It was torrential rain from morning till evening. Maybe at the most a dozen cars went out. The rest simply didn't bother. Gilles did go out, so also did Jody Scheckter in the other Ferrari. And I remember that day, Gilles was 11 seconds faster than anybody else. And the second guy, in fact, was his teammate. I mean, even now, I think about it, 11 seconds faster on a lap than anybody else. It beggars belief.
In case you don't recognize the voice, that is famous F1 author and journalist Nigel Roebuck. Nigel actually wrote a book on Gilles, and was one of the first sources I ever had about my hero. I loved listening to interviews of Nigel. I mean, you can listen to Nigel speak all day, can't you? I think in some ways, subconsciously, I've been influenced by him. Nigel is somebody that I definitely plan on reaching out to and would love to have an interview with. If you're a fan of Nigel Roebuck and would also like to hear such an episode, let me know in the comments below. But back to Gilles. 11 seconds. 11 seconds. Jody Scheckter stood there with a disbelieving look on his face. And then somebody broke the news to him that on race day the forecast was for snow, and reminded him that Gilles Villeneuve was also the world snowmobile champion. Gilles produced other great drives in '79 and matched his older teammate Jody Scheckter race for race. I mean, who can forget Zandvoort when he drove on two wheels after the rear suspension had broken away? But for me and many others, '79, Gilles Villeneuve, this was all about Dijon France and his battle with Rene Arnoux. This battle is still considered to this day the greatest F1 battle in history, as these two men battled it out for second place. Now, I would be foolish if I were to try and talk you through those final few laps in Dijon, so instead I'll let Murray Walker do the honors. So sit back and relax, close your eyes, and just imagine. If you haven't seen this battle, just imagine what this was all about.
Fourth gear, up into fifth when they go over the crest of the hill, up to 160, 165 miles an hour as they come down to the right-hander at Villeroy. And it's there that they can pass, and Arnoux's going to do it. Rene Arnoux is challenging for second as they come up to Villeroy, but Villeneuve will not give way. Arnoux's got the inside line and the shorter line, and he takes second place as they go into the right-hander and the left at Sablier. And now Renault's indeed are first and second in the French Grand Prix, and the French crowd is going mad, roaring in the background. Well, this is incredible. The twin-turbo Renaults appeared at Monaco, not there. And now we're into the start of the 79th and last lap but one, with Rene Arnoux second and Villeneuve go. Incredible! Villeneuve stood on everything, locked up his tyres, got the line, and he's back into second position on the last lap but one, and the French crowd aren't very happy about that, and who can blame them? This is incredible. This is the 79th lap in this 80-lap historic French Grand Prix, the oldest Grand Prix of them all. This is the 65th Grand Prix, and there has never been a more exciting battle for a major position than this one, with such French interest. Jabouille still ahead. And he's closed right up on Villeneuve, and he's going to try again. They're coming into the start of the last lap behind Jochen Mass in the A2 Arrows. And Arnoux does it, does he? And Villeneuve locks up. And Villeneuve has had to go wide, and Arnoux's on the inside as they go round Villeroy. He's got the shorter line. He's got second position. He's through. They bang wheels. He's off, and he's back again. Rene Arnoux off the circuit and back again, and now Villeneuve's in second position, and this is the last lap. And Villeneuve goes over the corrugations, and he nearly loses the front as they go up to Parabolique on the 80th and last lap. And he's back, he's in second position. Villeneuve is second in the Ferrari. Down to third position goes Arnoux. To La Bretelle, 80th. 80th lap in this 80-lap race, and there's less than a third of it to go. Now, can Arnoux, on the tremendously fast La Combe Courbe de Pouar section, 150 miles an hour, get past? They go past Jochen Mass, and Jabouille wins. Jean-Pierre Jabouille has won in the Renault. Who is going to be second? Villeneuve is at the moment. Arnoux is in third position. Into the Courbe de Pouar they come. There is Riccardo Patrese, and Villeneuve is second. Arnoux is third.
Reports said that the Renault engine was actually making over 100 horsepower more than the Ferrari. And Gilles' teammate, Jody Scheckter, was at the back of the pack, already lapped. Arnoux, when asked, "How are you handling the disappointment? Not only being French, but driving for a French team at the French Grand Prix and being beaten by Gilles Villeneuve?" Rene said with a smile on his face, "Today I was beaten by the fastest man alive." Gilles himself said it was a career highlight for himself, and he totally enjoyed driving alongside Rene. Total trust between two warriors. Yes, there was contact. Never malicious, never trying to take each other out. It was because they were both racing to each other's apexes. And at the end of the race, obviously with pretty worn out tires, this provided some fantastic racing that is lived on forever. Please, if you don't know the battle, YouTube it. It's real. Gilles Villeneuve, Rene Arnoux, Dijon France. It's a classic. And I must admit, I consider myself pretty lucky, because when people ask me, how did you get into Formula One? I say my first memory of Formula One was Dijon France. And their eyes light up, and we already know what we're talking about here. I mean, this was just, well, it just stands the test of time. Unfortunately for Ferrari, in 1980, their circumstances changed dramatically. This proved to be, up until that point, the worst season in Ferrari's history. Or should I say, Scuderia Ferrari's history. Other teams had moved on and adapted the new ground effects era. Ferrari didn't have this downforce. In fact, many people predicted that the Ferrari had 1/4 the downforce of all the other cars in the field. Gilles didn't even finish 6 out of the 14 races, and at the end of the season, he only had 6 championship points. Jody Scheckter, the defending champion, only had 2, and retired. Gilles and many other drivers hated the ground effect era. Gilles believed that it took the skill out of the driver's hands. The ground effect era essentially eliminated the suspension of the car. Gilles took a stand, and many of his fellow drivers stood beside him, including Niki Lauda.
Very obvious when I was away not racing 70, 80 and 81 that Formula One developed in an absolute stupid way. It means the cars, as the rule has been written out, performed so basically you could not drive them properly, and the driver was not any more important in it, because at some time of the course you just been a passenger, so you couldn't do anything. So I think it was very important to do something. What Gilles did and some other drivers, unfortunately not all the drivers, is to change the regulation and fight them. And as the politics in Formula One is a very big problem, so we had to have a very long fight. With Gilles at the time did a lot for it, and in the end we could win the fight. So the regulation for the next year's season is so that the cars are acceptable again and much safer.
Ironic that the man that Niki Lauda once called the craziest devil he ever knew was actually instrumental in forming the Grand Prix Drivers Association Safety Commission, improving the safety of the cars and the circuits, and he took a stand. This rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in the FIA. Here was a driver who'd never won a world championship before, and after only 2.5 seasons, here he was, taking on everyone, the sport, the tracks, the manufacturers. Despite this and the team's poor performance, the Villeneuve star continued on the rise. He was a supernova. Everyone wanted a piece of him. And the stories are like legend of him throughout Europe. Canadian Formula One team owner Walter Wolff was a personal friend of Gilles Villeneuve's and has a great story to tell.
Most of the people was there no difference because Gilles was always racing. Doesn't matter was in a Ski-Doo or there was in his Jeep that he drove around or there was in a helicopter that I remember when I taught first time Gilles flying the helicopter, the first minute or the first hours in helicopter flying, he learned from me. And I remember we were in Mandelieu flying together. And Gilles got in a helicopter, and he's the only man that I ever saw that after 3 hours flying knew how to hover a helicopter, keep the helicopter in a spot. And with the driving on the road, I remember one day I asked him for a favor to take my BB Ferrari to maintenance. By the time he took a maintenance, I got a car. He brought me the car back. I needed more maintenance before he took that car over there. So I don't know if there was any difference. He forgot that my personal car did not belong to Ferrari, that I had to pay the maintenance on that. That's not a racing car. But Gilles always waited to the last minutes, and then took him 2.75 of an hour from Monte Carlo to Fiorano, and that's normal people. Normal people drive roughly 5 hours, and if you are really quick, you can make it 3.5. But Gilles made it in 2 and 45 minutes. So I think it's no wonder I needed a new car after Gilles took it a few times to maintenance.
Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody took my car to take it to maintenance and destroyed it, I don't know if I'd be laughing about it. I guess that just stands as testament of what kind of person Gilles was as a friend, and everybody understood. Like Patrick Tambay said, everything in Gilles' life was done at 200 miles an hour. You already knew what you were getting going in. My personal favorite story is actually from Niki Lauda. And as he tells it, he says, him and Gilles were actually hanging out one night during race week, and they had agreed that they would meet up in the morning and travel to the racetrack together. When Niki Lauda was awakened, when Gilles Villeneuve was hovering his helicopter outside his 10th floor window of his hotel, and he had the door wide open and he was waving for Niki to jump in. There was only one Gilles Villeneuve, folks. There was just only one. Can you imagine if he did that today? I mean, look at Lewis Hamilton when he got in trouble in Monaco for doing a burnout or a donut or something. Here's Gilles Villeneuve driving from Monaco to Fiorano, 430 kilometers in 2 hours and 30 minutes. Apparently one time he did it in 2 hours and 10 minutes, beating a Cessna plane that raced the same route, who was a team engineer. I mean, these stories are real and they're incredible. Again, if you search the internet or watch on YouTube, you will find numerous instances where people will share these kind of stories and more about Gilles. And they're just amazing. So check them out. I bet you have fun. And you know what? Leave me a comment. See which ones you watched and what you thought of them. But moving along into the 1981 season, Ferrari just introduced their new turbo car and Gilles' new teammate, Didier Pironi. Harvey Postlewaite, who worked with the team, estimated that the car had 1/4 the downforce of the rest of the field, especially the superior cars, the Saudi Williams and the Brabhams. But he did expect that they'd have a power advantage over the Cosworths. Both statements proved to be true. The Ferrari had tons of power, but was absolutely terrible in the corners, which made it mind-boggling that Villeneuve won in Monaco and in Spain. The win in Spain proved to be one of the closest races in all of history. The top 5 finishers all finished within just about a second of each other, and Villeneuve himself defeating Jacques Lafitte at the line by 0.2.
And Gilles Villeneuve wins a fantastic drive, resisting pressure all the way. I am sure that he must be absolutely shattered in the car.
Everyone in the sport knew at this point how fantastic Gilles Villeneuve was, and rumors were that he was about to leave Ferrari. Ferrari, on the other hand, had a bit of an ace up their sleeve, with a very promising car due out in 1982, where they promised to be far more competitive and offered Gilles a chance to win the world title. Ferrari made good on their promise, and the car was good in 82, and so was Didier. The roles had already come full circle. Gilles once was the rookie on the team, and Scheckter was seen as the senior driver. Now Gilles was the senior driver. Didier was the apprentice. The rules had already been put in place a long time ago, and Gilles had followed them. Those rules changed at San Marino.
Gilles was significantly quicker than Pironi in qualifying. And it was Gilles who took the battle to the Renaults as soon as the race started. The Renaults ultimately, as they usually did, retired, which left the Ferraris running 1-2. It's, since the beginning of time, really the only rule about team orders at Ferrari has always been that if the two Ferraris become first and second in a race, the order in which they finish shall be the order in which they were running when they became first and second. And Gilles was in the lead, Pironi was second, that was the end of it. And I remember watching that, the latter part of the race, they were sort of swapping the lead, and I thought, they're simply having fun, they're just giving the crowd a bit of entertainment. And Gilles thought that too. However, what worried him was that whenever Pironi led a lap, the pace was picked up by a couple of seconds or so. Then Gilles would pass him again and back the pace off, because they were terribly marginal on fuel. There were no pit stops in those days, no refueling stops, of course. And they knew they were terribly marginal on fuel. And Gilles thought, what is going to look more stupid than two Ferraris way out in the lead of a race in Italy and running out of fuel? They'd never forgive us. So he was trying to rein the pace back, keep, in some sort of manageable limit so they would actually finish the race. And finally, sort of towards the end, he was in the lead once more, and Pironi was sitting behind him. They'd settled for a more relaxed pace by now, and Gilles thought, that's a relief, at least we're going to be all right. And on the last lap, at the very last overtaking place, which was ironically at the corner now named after him, he was past Pironi. Suddenly a sort of great burst of speed came past him, took Gilles completely unawares. He thought they were just cruising, tooling to the finish. And that was it. Pironi won the race. And Gilles was literally unable to speak after that race. I've never, I don't believe, ever seen a racing driver in such a fury. He wasn't screaming and shouting. He was just enraged. His trust had been betrayed.
The viewers at home had no idea what was going on. They truly thought they were watching a great race. They had no idea the betrayal that was going on inside the two Ferraris. The worst part of it was, after the race, Ferrari said nothing. They said nothing about team orders or the slow order. They said nothing. Gilles felt completely abandoned. And you know what? When I look at it now, it certainly sounds familiar, doesn't it? Makes me think about Sebastian Vettel and how he was treated the final year that he was with Ferrari. After the race, Gilles vowed never to speak to Didier Prony again and left the circuit in his helicopter with Jackie Stewart. Jackie Stewart later recalls, it was one of the most terrifying flights he'd ever been on. The next race was in Zolder, Belgium, where, with 8 minutes to go in qualifying, Gilles went out on a used set of qualifying tires, trying to better Didier's time. On his hot lap, Gilles came up upon the slower-moving Jochen Mass, who had already done his qualifying and was simply on a cool-down lap. Jochen thought that Gilles would want to go down the left-hand side, through the downhill left-hander, which was the ideal racing line. But Gilles on used tires was forced to go wide to carry speed, and unfortunately, Jochen Mass and Gilles Villeneuve collided. The Ferrari flew over 100 meters in the air before landing nose first in the sand. Gilles' racing seat had become dislodged, and he was ejected from the car. He was thrown clear across the track, and through 2 layers of catch fencing. Fellow drivers pulled over immediately, and emergency crews arrived shortly after. They worked on Gilles at the scene before flying him to the hospital, where sadly, later that night, he succumbed to his injuries. The date was May 8th, 1982. Thousands and thousands attended his funeral. World leaders, dignitaries, celebrities. Sadly, no one from the FIA or Ferrari attended. In a few weeks, it'll mark the 40th year anniversary since Gilles left us. And in 2022, it'll mark the 25-year anniversary of his son Jacques Villeneuve winning the F1 world title. It's hard to explain the effect that this had on me. As such a young boy, 9 years old, and my hero was gone. And he may be gone, but I know one thing. I'm doing this right now because of him. I fell in love with Formula One because of him. But he still lives on, in all those who knew him, and all those who were his fan. And now, he lives on through you. Salut Gilles. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. My name is Matthew Kane. If you'd like to connect with me on social media, please do. I am Dirty_F1 on Twitter, as well as TheDirtyAirF1Podcast on Instagram. And, on a side note, big thanks to my sister. I just launched my new website yesterday. It's called TheDirtyAirF1.com. Check it out. Contact me there. And let me know what you thought of this video. I'm very curious to know if there are other Villeneuve fans out there that still think about him as much as I do, 40 years later. He deserves to be remembered. And I hope all of you young fans get a chance to learn about him. I'm pretty sure you'll be happy that you did. I'd like to end this video with a few more quotes from Nigel Roebuck and Sir Stirling Moss. Until next time, everybody, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
I never raced against Gilles Villeneuve, but to me he was much more like us. He was one of our type, the people who race because we love racing. Above all, he was a racer, and a racer is not a driver. Or at least should I say a driver isn't a racer. Everybody who's out there is trying to win the race, but there are certain guys who will get in there and race because they love to race. The one thing you're in there for is to try to beat the other man. And I think he had the passion for driving, and I can understand this.
There was a great contrast between the man and the racing driver. As a man, he was an innocent. He was completely apolitical, totally honest, guileless. But it was like Clark Kent, in the phone box. Put him in a Formula One car, and he had a competitiveness beyond anything I've ever seen. I was struck by the fact that he was he was saying things that were actually quite startling, but in an extraordinarily calm way. His attitude was that, I don't believe I can hurt myself, and all I'm worried about is I don't want to damage the car. Enzo loved Gilles the way he did because he was such a fighter. That was always the characteristic in a racing driver that Enzo liked most. It was most important to him. And I think in Gilles he saw this absolute never give up, and just fight to the last. And Enzo loved that. Gilles was one of those who absolutely loved to drive. I think he just got extraordinary exhilaration from doing what he was doing. He was, the stories of Gilles on the road are legion. He essentially, in his Ferrari 308 road car, he was still, Gilles Villeneuve racing driver. And I drove him with him a couple of times, and it was, fond of him as I was, it wasn't anything I enjoyed very much. And journalists in those days were much more common than they are now. The sort of atmosphere around the drivers was far less rarefied then than it is now. I can't really explain why we became friends. We just, it just happens sometimes, doesn't it? You just get on with someone and you have the same sense of humour and whatever, and that was the way it was. He was extremely down to earth. And a little thing that came back to me was once we were on the phone. I rang him in Monaco, and we'd been on the phone for about 5-10 minutes, and he suddenly said, "Where are you?" And I said, "At home." And he said, "Well, put the phone down and I'll call you back." He said, "You're a journalist, you're not paid enough. I'm a racing driver, I'm paid too much." And that's something else that's never happened with any other driver either. So he was a one-off.